I'm Deborah Rogers, and I'm Executive Director of Energy Policy Forum. And I got involved with the shale gas questions back in 2009. And my background is finance. I started out in investment banking in London and then worked for several Wall Street firms here in the U.S., stockbroking. And I just noticed some financial anomalies, identified some anomalies in the balance sheets, cash flow statements, and so forth of various shale companies back in 2009, and I began to bring attention to them. And when that happened, there was a tremendous amount of pushback from industry, which always tells me that you're onto something, actually. And it just kind of grew from there. I started a dairy, an artisanal cheese-making operation on some land I inherited from my grandparents. And I learned that Chesapeake Energy had planned 12 high-impact wells right next to my property line, on the property next door to mine. And so I went to Chesapeake and I asked them, can you work with me to pipe the emissions away from the farm towards the other, the other side of the pad site, away from my farm, because we know without a shadow of a doubt that air toxics can deposit on pastures and forages, and ruminant animals magnify it up through the food chain. So whatever they're taking in off the pastures is magnified up through the milk or meat. And then again, when we eat those products, we magnify it in our systems. So I knew there could be a potential problem there. And I went to Chesapeake and they said, no, they wouldn't work with me. They didn't care whether it impacted my business or not. But what was interesting was I wasn't ever an activist. I'm part of the establishment. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about that. And I didn't know really how to fight it in the beginning. But Aubrey McClendon then came to town a few months later and began to speak out on shale gas, and he was throwing numbers out, and I'm a numbers person. And so I was sitting there doing the numbers in my head, and I was thinking, this doesn't make sense. I must have missed something, and I really thought I had. What he was saying basically was he was bragging about the amount of royalties that had been paid in Fort Worth, Texas, and where I live, which was the heart of the Barnett Shale, and this was back in 2009. And he was stating that we've paid out X number of dollars in royalties, and it was a big figure. But then he said, but you'll be very pleased to know that we've only drilled. Oh, and then he said we will be paying. We are projecting that we'll be paying X number of dollars forward in royalties between now, 2009, and 2015. And so I was sitting there and I was saying, okay, well, that's not that much growth in royalties that they're projecting from here on out. But then he made the mistake. He said, and you'll be very pleased to know that we've only drilled 15% of the wells that we intend to drill. And I thought, wait a minute, if that means we're going to get an 85% proliferation in wells for this relatively small growth in royalties from here between now and 2015, then somewhere, if I heard this correctly, somewhere back, we've already passed the point of diminishing returns here in North Texas. And I really thought I'd misheard him. And so I went home and I pulled Chesapeake's financials and started looking at them. And then there had been other questions that didn't really make sense to me. For instance, why were they still out there drilling in a frenzy? This was in 2009, after the economic downturn in 2008, when natural gas prices had plummeted about 50%. And traditionally, the industry, when prices plummeted so much, they would have shut in wells and just allowed prices to stabilize. And they didn't do that with shales. And I never could understand that, what was the logic behind that? And I asked quite a number of friends who were in the business, and no one had ever given me a good answer. And so when I pulled these financials, I started seeing some things like, A, there was absolutely no cash on their balance sheet. I mean, none. So I thought, all right, is this just Chesapeake, or does it run across the board? So I went in and I pulled the financials on most of the major players in the Barnett at that time, and I saw the same picture across the board. And that's when I knew something wasn't right. Now, I wasn't exactly sure I could pinpoint what wasn't right, but I had theories about it. And that's when I started going and publicly stating that I thought maybe there were some problems with shales. And of course, there was enormous pushback from the industry. Texas is, our identity is tied up with the oil and gas industry, even though it's not our primary revenue generator any longer, but our identity is tied up with oil and gas. And everyone thought I was insane to be speaking against the oil and gas industry. And also they thought that I was incorrect because we had been told that these wells would go on for decades and decades to come. I mean, I'm quoting industry there. And that these wells would be long-lived, that we would make a lot of money. And I was coming out suddenly and stating, I don't think that's going to be the case. I think we've pretty much made all the money we're going to make off of this, and we're going to see a downturn from here. And everyone thought that was insane. And as it turned out, I was correct. Already begin to see production numbers begin to slide. The example I like to give is the revenues from the city of Fort Worth itself, because in 2008, the city of Fort Worth got about $50 million in revenues from oil and gas, and I'm counting all the signing bonuses, everything in that. In 2009, it dropped off to about 19 million, and then in 2010, it trended back up to about 38. Well, the industry put the spin on it that, you see, it was just the economic downturn and we're back on track, and I thought, no, that's not the case, because you can't look at those numbers in isolation. You have to look at those numbers in comparison to how many wells were drilled between 2008 and 2010. And if you extrapolate it even, well, let me do that first. The number of wells had more than doubled between 2008 and 2010, even though revenues to the city were sliding. I've now since gone in and completed that picture up through the end of 2012. And so in 2008, we had 50 million in revenues. By 2012 year end, we had about 22, 23 million, so it had more than halved, but the number of wells has gone up, it's quadrupled since that time. So as you can see, this is the problem with shales. You get the most money you're ever going to get from shales in the first 12 months, and then it slides off a cliff. But the number of wells that they drill continues to go up because they're trying to keep the production platform or plateau stable, but they have not been able to do it in any shale play to date, not even close. And so you have this frenzy of drilling, which means a frenzy of environmental problems as well. But they cannot keep the revenue stable or the production stable. It just slides. That's a bit of a problem.